I like the boldness and the use of blue. I like that this top nav bar extends the color of the browser in Safari. I think it's all relatively clean and, like I say, bold, which makes good use of the sort of simple visual style because the boldness helps to make it stand out even if it's relatively simple visually. I think this image should be replaced with a higher resolution image because, especially on a Retina monitor, it stands out as being a bit blurry, and that's a shame when everything else is so sort of clean. It feels like it doesn't fit. But I do like the blue is sort of echoed in the screenshot versus the rest of the website. I also quite like this sort of bowed background transition because it blends with the sidebar in this image. So that's a nice sort of transition that takes into account the content that it's transitioning from and to. When the use of blue in all of these places is solid in the sense that this link is entirely blue, this button is entirely blue, this logo is entirely blue, this gradient from black to blue feels a bit strange. Part of me wonders if it's because everything else is blue up until this point, or this shade of blue at least, is interactive. But you do have the image has that same blue, so it doesn't feel as if you're reserving that blue for interactivity. But I wonder if that's the reason that you sort of use the gradient here rather than just solid blue. I don't think it's necessarily needed for visual interest either, or visual variety, because you've already established that solid blue is fine here, and in this view, you don't have a lot of solid blue, so it's not as if this needs to stand out or look different compared to other solid blue things on the screen. So this feels like a bit of a departure and maybe feels a bit out of place. I quite like all of this. There's a layout and the spacing here, but then you've got this really big gap here that feels a bit strange, especially because there's also a big gap between this and build. And as far as I can tell, these are tabs that change the sort of section below. But this doesn't feel particularly related to either the text above or the sections below. So there's something that feels a bit strange about this use of spacing. If you had to move it closer to one of them, I'd move it closer to this because that's what it's most closely related to, since it's changing what this section shows. One thing I will say here, and maybe the reason that you made this choice instead, is that having this centered sort of run of tabs close to this large title, especially when this large title is left aligned and not center aligned, that would feel a bit strange. Suddenly you'd shift from a center aligned element to a left aligned element. I can see why you'd want to put a bit of space between these two so it doesn't feel like it's suddenly shifting on you visually. But because these are so closely related, I think that's a problem worth solving. Maybe that's even just center aligning the title and giving it a slightly different visual treatment, maybe a background, for example, so that it feels related to these, but doesn't feel like it's sort of blending in with them. Maybe it that background behind the word build might give you a bit of visual separation. This is a minor nitpick, but the blue text here in the against the black background is hard to read. And I know that this image is not there to be read, but I think it sends, and this might even be the type of text that's used in the product, so maybe this is more product feedback. But I think human eyes want to sort of resolve images like this, and so the fact that this is harder to resolve because it's harder to read because of low contrast against the black background sort of draws my eye to it, but not in a particularly positive way. I quite like these sort of layouts, the blue text and the paragraphs below them. It's simple, but if you have a bit more text, like in this case, I think simple works better. It doesn't feel clear how this is aligned. If I bring in a guideline here, you've got quite a bit of space between the top of this white container on the right and the top of this blue text. Especially when you bring in the title of this section, it creates this very large gap between these two. I suspect the gap is meant to be smaller just because you've got the bottom of this is probably sort of the spacing between the bottom of build and the top of this container is more reasonable, but then you've got extra space between the top of this container and the top of sign up new environments quickly. I assume what's happened here is roughly that this block of text has been centered vertically with this container, but it's hard to tell. It does feel like there's a bit more space at the bottom here. And I think you've got a similar problem with these buttons where, yes, it's a bit more reasonable the space you've got here, but it's a bit less reasonable the space you've got here. It's much bigger. So just because this is centered feels like it's sort of should be spaced equally from both. Potentially the solution there is to just have the image and get rid of this container, or use the container to your advantage and have it resize, this padding around it, so that everything aligns more neatly. This is another minor issue, but I feel like this social proof logo carousel is moving a bit too fast. I suppose you want to show a lot of company names, and there's some impressive names in there, so showing them all or more of them is more impressive by that logic. But I'm used to seeing these move slowly, and so I think it's just the expectation I have that they'll move slowly that makes this catch my eye, which potentially is not a bad thing. In this case, you're trying to show all of these companies, and having this catch your eye is potentially good. Oh, there's something interesting happening. Okay, so it looks like that cycles all the way back to the start. I'm sure the people who are building this know this, but there is a way to essentially duplicate this and have the cycle back to the start be instant, so that it always feels as if it's scrolling to the left, rather than doing this sort of reset. Although it's quite fun to watch. Part of my point was going to be that even though it's fun to watch and maybe is draws your eye because it's moving so quickly, it distracts you from potentially text up here. If I'm trying to read this, but this keeps drawing my eye, maybe some important details in here are lost. So this dark to light blue gradient feels better on these much larger numbers than it does on these titles. I think maybe because they're centerpieces, suddenly there's more room for that sort of visual expression. I'm just checking the imagery throughout the website. So this is a screenshot. This is a screenshot. This suddenly feels slightly out of place. It's a sort of illustration when all I've seen so far is screenshots. And it's not a bad illustration. I don't think it's, should be removed. And it does feel like it fits the idea of containers because that's what it's showing. It's just feels a bit out of place because there hasn't been that sort of cartoonish illustration style used before this point. I also think just because you've got this left aligned content, this aligns nicely, but then this feels out of place because it's not centered, but it's not right aligned. You've already used this container style here to make this screenshot fill the space more, and I've talked about how maybe that could be used differently. But down here it feels like that's missing just because you'd want this illustration to fill this space more. Currently it's further left than it feels like it should be. The left aligned text here feels like it's at odds with the centered text in this sort of group above it. So I think these might, just because you're showing here that you've got this pattern for center aligned text and then you're sort of ignoring that pattern, maybe where it would make more sense if these were a bit less wide and all centered, perhaps that would work better. It might be that you've already tried that and decided against it, but perhaps with containers around them, this would feel a bit better because you wouldn't feel like things are jumping around. I think as it is, just these left edges feel like they're in slightly odd places compared with the sort of composition as a whole. I think it's expectations set by other websites. I half expected these to have a hover effect when I hovered over them. Usually I see some sort of, it introduces color when I hover over one. I don't think that's necessary personally on this website, but I think the pattern used here made me think that would happen. So it's not necessarily a case I'm disappointed when it doesn't. Just maybe someone wonders why it doesn't happen. The alignment here feels like, because there's this left edge here created by these two titles, and then a left edge down here created by this large blue container. And so this sort of indentation feels a bit strange. I would expect this to have a container and for the left edge of the container to be aligned with everything. But since it doesn't, it feels a bit odd that there's this indentation here rather than the left edge of this content being more left. And then I guess the last thing I'll say is that this all feels fine, except the button here has this sort of light grey outline. That doesn't feel quite right against a darker blue background. It feels a bit sort of muddy or weak, you know, just to have it remove some of the sharp edge you'd get by having plain white against the blue. So unless this changes, maybe in dark mode it changes, and you have, you know, different rule here, I think here I would just use white background on the button with no border. I've also just noticed that there's this sort of dark blue or black outline around this. I think for the same reason you don't need that, since the blue will have a good contrast with the white. You could probably remove the border from here as well, since it would normally be used to make things more sharp, but here it's sharp enough because of the contrast between blue and white.